For the past few seasons, we've been on a journey, not just across headlines and interviews, but across the very soul of the Caribbean. At its core, this program has never just been about news. It's about truth, especially the ones hiding in plain sight. It's about listening to the things we don't always want to hear and asking the questions others might avoid. Investigative journalism, for me, isn't about spectacle. It's about serving the public interest. It's about understanding the forces shaping our lives, the ones in the bedroom, the boardroom, the ballot box, and the back room. And so, in this final episode, or what may be the final episode, we bring you some of the most essential conversations we have had. Stories that challenged systems, elevated voices, and pulled back the veil on power, pain, and possibility. This is The Conversation, and it begins where all transformation does, with the personal. In this segment of the conversation, psychologist Dr. Sidney McGill explores the impact of technology on modern intimacy, gender roles, emotional growth, and mental health, particularly among men and young people. His observations reflect a growing reality in the Caribbean and beyond, that the personal and the political are deeply connected. Let's listen.
There's this increasing screen dependency because of the proliferation of smartphones. Almost everyone has access to the internet. And what that has done is to reduce face-to-face communication. And if you are in an intimate relationship, face-to-face communication is integral to the development of that relationship. And that tends to lead to emotional distance.
The decline in face-to-face communications is more than a social shift. It's shaping how relationships begin, develop, and sometimes how they end. For many, it's also changing how vulnerability is expressed.
He's afraid of trying to meet someone face-to-face. Like, for example, a girl that he sees he likes. And he'd like to, say hi to her and, begin a conversation and hope that it goes somewhere. But he said he's afraid of that because he might be seen as, he might be accused of sexual harassment.
These changes are producing new forms of anxiety, particularly around dating, consent, and interpersonal risk. Digital platforms offer a sense of control, but that comfort often comes at the cost of deeper connections.
Is what they call PIED, which is porn-induced erectile disorder or dysfunction. And what it means is that the person gets so used to being excited sexually, watching porn, that in real life sexual encounter, it is a lot tamer for him. He doesn't get the kind of intense excitement.
The science is still emerging, but psychologists like Dr. McGill have noted a pattern. Digital arousal isn't always transferable to real-life intimacy, and that disconnect can affect more than just physical performance. It can shape our identity.
Because he's been watching so much porn and been having less actual sex with a person, he does not have the skills, he has not developed the pro-social skills necessary for the relationship to build, for the sexual encounter to be, exciting and enjoyable. I'm not saying that all men are like that because he's so accustomed to instant gratification. He may just, not know what it takes to arouse a woman.
These aren't just sexual matters. They are questions of communication, emotional literacy, and expectations, how gendered assumptions are reinforced by media, and how they influence what people believe intimacy should look and feel like.
Making love, you're thinking of deepening and expressing your love to your partner. And I'm assuming that these partners are committed, you're in a committed love relationship.
Yes.
Then the act of knowing your partner inside out, that should be everybody's goal in a loving relationship. So it means, which means you're taking risks.
At the core of it all, the challenge of vulnerability. Relationships require risk, reflection, and a willingness to grow, and that, Dr. McGill argues, takes practice.
Why do that? Why do that when the goal is to get to know me better?
Yes.
Get to explore my body.
For couples navigating these issues, the invitation is clear: to move from performance toward presence, from external stimulation toward mutual discovery.
Discipline is doing the right thing in spite of how you feel, And so I'm thinking in a sexual encounter, what's important to you should not just be what you want to do and how you want to feel, but what your partner wants.
Discipline and selflessness, words not often associated with intimacy, may in fact be essential to building a healthy emotional life, especially when love is redefined not just as feeling, but as active care.
For children, it's early, much early exposure to pornography. And I'm saying much early, I'm thinking from 3 years old.
No, man, say that slowly. What you mean? So you're saying, am I to understand that children, babies, because a 3-year-old is essentially a toddler,
yes,
is being exposed to pornography at that age and stage?
Yes, and even some misguided parents, especially the men. And if it's a 3-year-old boy, and he can't, and the boy does refuse to go to bed or to sleep. He just give up and let the boy sit there and watch it with him. And so I think porn is becoming so ubiquitous. It's becoming such a daily fear. It is losing the kind of Christian immorality that we attach to watching it, because it's become such a natural thing. It's second nature to watch porn.
Well, persons have argued that sex is natural. So because it's natural, then why hide it? But what is it that you're saying differently from what those would be saying?
I'm saying that children are not emotionally developed to deal with the intense emotional things that happen.
Perhaps the most sobering part of the conversation is this: the age at which exposure to explicit content begins. Dr. McGill warns that many children are seeing material long before they're emotionally equipped to process it, raising serious questions for parents, educators, and policymakers alike. As we close this segment, we return to the idea that the personal is political. What happens in our homes, relationships, and emotional lives echoes across the wider culture. To build stronger societies, we must not only address systems, but also nurture connection, growth, and care. We continue by examining one of the region's most complex and pressing challenges: violence. In an insightful conversation with Dr. Diana Thorburn of Capri, we explored the structural and systemic roots of crime, especially in Jamaica's informal and undeserved communities. This segment looks beyond individual choices and focuses on the environments that shape them.
Informal communities, or we could also say semi-formal communities, are essentially at the base of it places where the people who live there do not have legal tenure to where they live, and they cannot sell or trade the place that they live in or cash in on its value.
So like squatter settlements?
Squatter settlements, also some of the government housing that came up in the 70s is also, so anywhere, if you live somewhere and you don't have a title to it, and you can't sell it or you can't rent it, essentially you don't have legal tenure to that place. And you basically have insecure tenure to that place. That means you depend on someone else for the right to live where you live. That is kind of the root of the issue.
1 in 4 Jamaicans live in an informal or semi-formal settlement. These are not anomalies. They are urban reality, but in the eyes of the state, they remain invisible, uncounted, underserved, and unheard.
The drivers of Jamaica's murder rate are Jamaica's gangs, which operate with impunity, largely based in informal communities. And they operate with impunity because the informality of those communities serve systemic political purposes.
So could we then make the assumption that if we're able to fix the issue of informal communities, then we ought to be able to fix the issue of gangs and gang violence?
That's the proposal. That's the thinking. So the theory of change there is if you look at Jamaica's gangs, I'm going to be very specific about what we're talking about. So you'll have a very high murder rate in a U.S. city, Baltimore, Chicago, and they introduce a program of drug addiction treatment and employment programs and perhaps violence interruption, and you'll see a fall in the murder rate in that city. And that may be fine because those are the problems that drive the murder rate in that city. We don't have a violence that is fueled by drug addiction, which is a problem across many U.S. cities. If you look at Philadelphia, for example, many of the U.S. cities that have high murder rates, there's a drug addiction and drug trafficking problem. We don't have that problem. Those initiatives, those interventions are not going to work for us. We are not dealing with a situation where people are having issues so much with not being able to resolve arguments peacefully. Yes, we have that, but that's not what's driving up our murder rate. So a violence interruption program is probably not going to do much good here because that's not the driver of the issue. The drivers of the issue are the conditions in which gangs are able to operate, sustain themselves, reproduce themselves. I'm sure you've heard before where police or someone else would say, as you cut one down, 10 more emerge. That's because the environment is conducive to that. It's not a hydra. It's not an animal that has this magical power of reproducing itself. It's because the context and the environment and the circumstances are conducive to gangs operating. And so we have to change the environment. It's not about individual people having, had a traumatic childhood and so they are compelled to act out violence. Yes, children who have suffered trauma are more likely to commit violence as adults. They're not going to pick up a gun and murder 8 people in a community while they're playing dominoes. That is a function of a completely different mechanism, a completely different set of incentives, and that's what the gangs are. It's a very specific way of operating that we have to deal with that very specific thing.
So help us to understand, though, before we get into labor market disengagement, that was the second part of the question. I think I've gotten so much now that I don't want to yet jump into that. Unpack for us, what should we consider to be informal settlements or informal communities, and why is that such an issue, and how does it breed the kind of violence that you're talking about?
Yeah, so informal communities, or we could also say semi-formal communities, are essentially at the base of it places where the people who live there do not have legal tenure to where they live, and they cannot sell or trade the place that they live in or cash in on its value.
So like squatter settlements?
Squatter settlements, also some of the government housing that came up in the 70s is also, so anywhere, if you live somewhere and you don't have a title to it, and you can't sell it or you can't rent it, essentially you don't have legal tenure to that place. And you basically have insecure tenure to that place. That means you depend on someone else for the right to live where you live. That is kind of the root of the issue. Having a title to where you live comes with many, many benefits. It gives you access to the formal financial system, it gives you access to capital, but most importantly, it gives you the security of tenure of where you live. You don't have to worry about somebody coming to kick you out, somebody coming to burn you out, somebody coming to evict you because you have your title, right? Or if you're paying rent and you have a proper lease agreement. that would also be constituted. But 20% of Jamaicans live, well, that's the low estimate.
That's the low
20 to
end.
25% of Jamaicans live in places that they do not have a legal right to live there. And that is the root of the problem.
So that's upward of 500,000 people we're talking about.
600,000
Yes.
is a rough estimate that corresponds with that. And so when you don't have tenure and you don't have security of where you live, you don't have any say in what's going on around you. Moreover, most of those communities, the state is hardly there. They're not, the state does not govern those communities. The state doesn't have a presence in those communities. They're not collecting taxes in those communities. The people in there might not even be counted on the census in those communities. One of the things that you'll see JSIF does in ZOSO communities or almost any community that it goes into, one of the first things it does is give people TRN. Sometimes even get their birth certificate sorted out, right? It's to get people into the formal system. Those communities are largely isolated socially, economically. Many of them, the housing quality is poor, the sanitation is poor, health conditions are not optimal. So there are a lot of issues that come with informality that mitigate against those communities and the people in those communities being able to operate as citizens in the broader society, including them being able to call the police if somebody comes to their door and is trying to invade their place.
So
They don't have that right.
So the argument is not that persons from informal communities are the primary violence producers. That's not the issue.
That's not the issue.
The issue is that these informal or semi-formal settlements give rise to that particular issue that we're having.
Yes, and I'm glad you said that because I want that to be very clear. The majority of people, I mean, you've heard it said, there's a very small number of people who drive up our murder rate to this astronomical level that it is. It is not the people in informal communities that are bad people. It is the context and the structure and the system of what makes an informal community informal. It is the fact that those communities are outside of the law often, and so it is we can call it a safe haven, perfect breeding ground for criminality, and in the case of Jamaica, in the perfect way for an organism such as a gang to come up, because they're outside of the law.
When the state withdraws, gangs fill the vacuum, not just with fear, but with services, protection, and control. It's not a mystery, it's a system.
When you don't have tenure and you don't have security of where you live, you don't have any say in what's going on around you. Moreover, most of those communities, the state is hardly there. They're not, the state does not govern those communities. The state doesn't have a presence in those communities. They are not collecting taxes in those communities. The people in there might not even be counted on the census in those communities. One of the things that you'll see JSIF does in ZOSO communities or almost any community that it goes into, one of the first things it does is give people TRN. Sometimes even get their birth certificate sorted out, right? It's to get people into the formal system. Those communities are largely isolated socially, economically. Many of them, the housing quality is poor, the sanitation is poor, health conditions are not optimal. So there are a lot of issues that come with informality that mitigate against those communities and the people in those communities being able to operate as citizens in the broader society.
The challenge isn't the people, it's the politics. And when you strip people of rights, space, safety, and services, what you get is not just discontent, you get violence on a national scale.
What we basically found, to cut straight to the chase, was that we couldn't find that a single intervention had had any effect whatsoever for several reasons, in part because there were so many interventions happening that because they're not monitored and measured in a way that would have allowed us to say one or the other, allowed us or anyone to say one or the other, we couldn't have identified a single intervention in Augusttown. And we also discovered in looking at the literature and the research that had gone before that this was not an Augusttown specific problem, that the problem of measuring the outcomes of anti-violent social interventions was widespread. We've never really been able to do it for several reasons, in part because of the way that the outcomes are measured, the way that the interventions are done, the documentation, the monitoring and evaluation. And so we had to do a different kind of inquiry, which was to try and understand, well, what potential do these kinds of interventions have for reducing violence? And that kind of took us down the path to where the report that we came up with in mid-year this year called Groundwork for Peace. And one of the recommendations out of that report was to deprioritize social interventions. This was the headline that got a lot of attention. And the thinking behind that was backed by, a great deal of evidence that went into the report, that social interventions that address issues of unemployment, education, parenting, skills training, community unity, sports even, conflict resolution. I'm trying to think of the plethora of goals that many of these interventions have. They're not going to ever be able to reduce violence in the Jamaican context because those are not the things that make us have a high murder rate.
To change the outcome, we must change the equation. And that means not just doing more, but doing differently. Policy without structure is policy without impact. The argument is not that persons from informal communities are the primary violence producer.
It is the context and the structure and the system of what makes an informal community informal. It is a fact that those communities are outside of the law often, and so it is we can call it a safe haven, perfect breeding ground for criminality. The state has failed in that regard is just in allowing them to stay there.
Dr. Thorburn's research calls us to look inward. Violence is not just a police problem. It's a planning problem, a policy problem, a political problem. And if we're serious about fixing it, we must stop blaming the communities on the margins and start fixing the systems that keep them there. The conversation about violence must evolve from punishment to prevention, from retribution to reform. Because until the people living in informal settlements are treated as full Jamaican citizens, this crisis will continue to haunt us all. Dr. Thorburn's argument invites us to shift our lenses from personal blame to structural accountability. Violence, she suggests, is not merely a behavioral problem, but a symptom of disconnection, legal, economic, and civic. In this segment, we examine a recent public debate that raised important questions about governance, transparency, and public trust. The appointment of Mr. Dennis Chung as Chief Technical Director of the Financial Investigations Division. This sparked national dialogue, particularly around process, qualification, and institutional credibility.
A main requirement has been removed to facilitate Dennis Chung being able to meet the requirements. So it's the case like anybody that applies for a job knows before they apply for the job what the job requirements are in terms of qualification, experience, etc. And in this case, the person that was selected did not meet the original job requirements. And then when you hear from the shout, one of them, and very important one I'll explain shortly, has been removed. That is a big red flag.
The removal of certain job requirements was noted by some commentators as cause for concern. For them, it raised questions about whether standard protocols were followed and whether the integrity of the hiring process was preserved.
You now have a situation where the person that is in charge of the investigation has already told the public that he believes the matter should never have been referred to investigation.
Some also pointed to earlier public comments made by Mr. Chung prior to his appointment and questioned whether those statements could impact perceptions of objectivity in cases currently being reviewed by the FID.
You have 100-meter race at the Olympics.
Yeah.
And you have 110-meter hurdle.
Yeah.
The difference between the hurdles and the 100-meter is that all lanes have the same number of hurdles
Yes.
between the starting line
And the
and the
finish.
finishing line.
Plus, there's an additional 10 meter.
No. How would you feel seeing somebody on the podium getting the gold medal if the hurdles in his lane was removed and he was basically running a flat race?
This analogy was used to express concerns about fairness, particularly whether all applicants were subject to the same standards during the recruitment process.
The executive arm of government, the executive branch of government, through whatever shenanigans it did, removed a job requirement. I am curious as to the opinion of the Public Services Commission to fill a post with a lesser candidate meeting lesser requirements than previously it was seeking a candidate to fill.
And then we asked about the effects that you think, the mid-process job requirement here changes would have on public's confidence now, because that's the issue that we're now having.
Can I make reference to another media house? The Jamaica Gleaner did an editorial where it described the situation in the following way. It's a matter of public trust and public confidence. There is no scenario any longer where the public can believe that any result of any investigations led by Dennis Chung can be acceptable as objective and appropriate.
Others went further, suggesting that the process may have impacted the public's confidence in the FID. Whether or not that perception is justified, the issue highlighted wider concerns around governance and the role of public institutions in maintaining credibility.
The People's National Party will honor the approved organizational structure, the approved core competencies, and the approved job requirements.
Calls have since emerged for a review of how such appointments are made, with advocates suggesting clearer, more transparent structures to safeguard institutional integrity, regardless of political administration. Whether or not the concerns raised are validated, this case speaks to wider issues about how we ensure integrity in public office and how citizens come to trust the system meant to serve them. When Hurricane Beryl roared across the Caribbean as the earliest Category 5 storm on record, it exposed far more than physical vulnerabilities. In this conversation with climate scientist Professor Michael Taylor and Sherrian Farquharson of the SICRI, we unpack what Beryl teaches us, not only about the science of climate change, but the urgency of adapting how we build, live, and plan across the region. Beryl's strength wasn't just about bad luck. It was driven by unusually warm ocean temperatures and climate shifts that are changing what we consider normal.
Ocean temperatures throughout the Caribbean Sea, going into the east of the Caribbean Sea, into the tropical Atlantic, which are just abnormally warm. And these abnormally warm temperatures actually have been there for the last 12 months or longer. Climate change would have contributed somewhat, because climate change has been warming our oceans. It's not the only thing contributing, but that was the key fuel for the warm oceans, for unprecedented things about Beryl.
Are there any other contributing factors that you can pinpoint to say that these other things might be contributing there?
Well, for this hurricane season in particular is projected to be an extreme hurricane season. And that's actually one of the frightening things about Beryl, that you could get Beryl at the beginning of the hurricane season, in a season that is projected to be extreme. Why is it projected to be extreme? One, the very warm ocean temperatures. But there's also a little phenomenon that we often hear about called El Niño. And its counterpart, La Niña. We have been having all of last year an El Niño, and El Niño is the warming of the equatorial Pacific oceans. But when you put warm waters in the Pacific, because the impacts don't stay there, they cause what we call strong vertical shear, or really how strong the winds are in opposite directions in our region. We have been under the regime of strong vertical shear, but El Niño has now decided to come to an end. And so we're coming out of El Niño. And so the vertical shear that would pull apart, clouds forming, is now weakening. And so you get the warm oceans plus the very weak vertical shear. It's just a kind of ideal situation for unprecedented and an extreme hurricane season.
So I'm no scientist though, but somehow that sounds to me that the drought conditions are going to be more exaggerated then.
Well, actually, this season, when we have vertical shear El Nino, we actually relate it to dry in the Caribbean. And for the very same reasons why we relate it to less hurricane activities. But now that we're coming out of El Nino, potentially going into La Nina, which is kind of the opposite, it means that we actually have good conditions for floods and heavy rains and extreme hurricanes.
What was once considered the safe zone is now squarely in the storm's path. For Caribbean nations, that means old assumptions must give way to new strategies.
One of those things comes down to first planning and proper planning. So typically, when utilities are planning, they do what is called an integrated resource plan. But what we have introduced at the SICRI to the region is what's called an integrated resource and resilience plan. Now, with the resilience part of the plan, we start looking at what are the hazards and risks, what are the impacts of climate on your traditional electricity generators, as well as what's going to be the impact on your renewable energy systems. And then we start looking at building flexibility and diversity into the energy system. So you don't want to have all of your eggs in one basket. You want to be able to include as many of the resources as are available to you, whether it's going to be hydropower mixing with solar, with wind, with energy storage. And then there are other opportunities like microgrids that can help you to be able to make your critical infrastructures more agile, or give you the opportunity to repower individual communities. And I just want to say that, the Climate Studies Group at Mona, which Professor Taylor leads, helps us with incorporating the weather and climate data into the planning process, so that when we're looking at the planning timeline for 5, 15, 25 years, that we're able to see how are things now, as well as how are they expected to change, so we can get the right balance and the right mix as it relates to the infrastructure, but also as it relates to being able to respond to disasters. So I had mentioned the microgrids. That's another critical opportunity. So you can imagine having a hospital that is able to function islanded from the rest of the grid. Mm-hmm. So I saw, JPS, they were giving their reports as they were being able to restore power. But if you have these microgrids, that gives you the opportunity to focus on bringing back up your critical infrastructure, because they're in separate pockets that can operate in isolation.
Planning for climate resilience isn't just about seawalls or shelters. It's about infrastructure like microgrids and flexible energy systems that can function even when the central grid fails.
What Beryl is teaching us, that when we begin the hurricane season, we can begin it with a bang. With a bang. And I mentioned before, that's one of the frightening lessons we have to learn, because Beryl has come, it has devastated a number of Caribbean islands, but there is no guarantee that we will not get another one when the hurricane season would normally peak in August and September. So we now have to learn the lessons around dealing with having that. One of the simple lessons, is that we are now in a mode of rebuilding after Beryl. But if there is a potential for another Beryl later in the season, how do we rebuild so that the infrastructure we are putting in place now will survive a category 4 and 5? Mm-hmm. And so one of the lessons is not just planning now, changing our mode of planning that we can get it this early, but it also means changing our mode of response. We have to have the systems in place to ensure that that roof we're putting back on the hospital, those utility infrastructures that we're putting back in place, have the potential to survive going in another Beryl this very season.
Adaptation now means designing systems that don't just survive one storm, but endure a season or a decade of shocks and strain.
some of the gaps that were exposed, and I'm not sure if I want to call it so much a gap as to say that I think as the climate changes, we have to be agile. We have to just adapt. Because I think there are some things that you can have some level of certainty with predicting, but there are some things that are unprecedented.
Simply
You're going to hear that word several times. They're simply unprecedented. And so all you have to do is to learn as you go, and to be agile and to learn from each other, so that we can build better together. So we have building codes that can be shared. There is a regional energy efficiency building code that not just speaks to the energy efficiency, but also the structure of the buildings, that has been voluntarily adopted in some countries, that will help, because we recognize that these kind of buildings are not just required in Jamaica and in Haiti, where you get a lot of the storms passing through, but no, in the Eastern Caribbean, in the southern part of the Eastern Caribbean in particular. When you hear about Tobago being impacted by Hurricane Beryl, Trinidad and Tobago don't get tropical storms.
Again, it's the same word. It's the same word, unprecedented.
Right,
but Prof wanted to say something
let
earlier.
me pick up on something Sherian is saying. It's not a gap, but one of the things we have to recognize is that these documents, these approaches, these policies have to now become living documents. Because the truth is climate is changing. And even for us as scientists, climate is changing at a faster pace than even some of the projections that we had had. So yes, you create a building code based on the scientific projections for the now, but these projections are also changing. And so you always have to be going back and revising your disaster response. Yes, we have gotten the time without electricity down from 4 months to probably to 2 weeks. We'll never be without an impact of a storm. But what now do we learn that we can get a category 5 in June, and we can get it again in August? Well, maybe we now need to figure out, what Sherian was talking about. We now need to decentralize some of the energy resources so that a hospital can stand on its own for those 2 weeks while it waits on the utility company to come up. Maybe there are remote communities that need to have their energy sources. And we can talk about other things as well. Talk about water, Maybe the tanks have to be now a little bigger because of the change. In other words, climate is changing and we have to learn now. We can't say we have responded to climate change in a document and leave it there. We have to always make these things living documents.
One takeaway, our response frameworks, from building codes to disaster plans, must evolve. They can't be static. They must grow with the science, the data, and the lived experience. Is there a space now for greater collaboration between the scientific community in terms of providing the policymakers with the data that is required and the insights to strengthen our regional adaptation strategy?
Well, I think the obvious answer that is a yes, but you don't want to get me off now going on how much we have supported the scientific and research community. For example, in the region, there is no, for example, scientific research fund which to support doing exactly contextual science research to support the things that we need, in the region. We basically leave it up and say the universities must do that, but do it with what resources? Resourcing scientific research and resourcing the science community now becomes part of our adaptation strategy to climate, And yes, when we do produce the information, we now have to figure out the mechanisms to get that information utilized so that decision makers have it at the tip of their fingers. Thankfully, we have a good working relationship with SICRI, with SEDEMA, the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, with other regional agencies, But we also have to have that deep, close relationship with governments. Governments are the seat of planning, There is clearly a need. To answer your original question, yes, but I'll allow Sherian to come in.
No, Prof, I definitely agree with you that there is definitely a need for closer collaboration. And we have seen where we are making strides working with the university. There is a regional universities network that we work very closely with. So not just with the UAE, but with all the national universities across the region. And one of the things that we aim to do is that as we are doing the projects and as we're doing the policy planning, that we incorporate the research that's coming out of the universities as a part of the process. But again, the decisions are made by our parliamentarians, by our government. And so we have to ensure that it is distilled so that they can understand and grasp the urgency of the outputs of our scientific research so that we can close that loop and ensure that the funding also comes back in. Having been able to make those informed decisions, that the funding comes back in, because as Prof said, these have to be living documents, because the climate it's not that the climate will change or has changed, it is changing. So we have to continuously update what it is that is coming from the scientific community to inform the policies and the decisions that are going to impact the lives and livelihoods of the people in the Caribbean.
The solution lies in breaking silos, bridging the gap between researchers, policymakers, and communities, because resilience isn't a single project, it's a collective practice.
The response has to be by everybody.
Yeah.
It's not just by the government. It has to be a personal response by you as well. You have to take your own personal responsibilities for the house that you are in, the communities that you are a part of, and see how they can be resilient. Government will never have enough finances, period, to do everything. But the private sector can certainly play a role in driving resilience, starting with their own selves. You know, we are very much dependent on private sector and the outputs that they produce, whether it's for food or that kind of thing. So they have an opportunity, you know, to play a significant role in building resilience. You know. Same for the NGO sector, you know, especially in communicating messages, especially in rallying communities. Beryl clearly has taught us, you know, that we have communities that are remote. Probably the first line of resilience has to be organizing the community to respond.
What Hurricane Beryl showed us is clear. Climate change is no longer a distant threat. It's here, and it's rewriting the rules for how the Caribbean must live, plan, and survive. From energy to infrastructure, from policy to personal responsibility, resilience will take all of us. As calls for stronger governance grows louder across the Caribbean, this conversation with legal and political analysts Clyde Williams and Jermaine Barrett looked at the recent Integrity Commission report and what it reveals, not just about one office, but about how we understand leadership, ethics, and accountability in public life.
So in the investigation, there are several issues that arise. One issue is the question of the Prime Minister having bank accounts.
The findings around undeclared accounts were ultimately not deemed criminal, but they sparked renewed discussion about public trust, ethics, and what standards should apply to our leaders.
The tax compliance relates to the following companies: Imperium,
Yes.
Estate Bridge,
Yes.
Positive Media, and Green Emerald.
Yes.
4 companies. In circumstances where these entities appear to be engaged in business activities, but they are filing nil income. So you know, it's a red flag, he says.
Help us to understand the idea of filing nil income, though, because what if your expenditure and your income are pretty much the same? You
Yes.
know, what does that mean?
Well, you see, the tax authorities say you must set out the thing, man. You must give us, make us see the details. But when you file nil now,
There's nothing to show.
so you must set out the details. That is the whole idea of the notion. So let me read a little bit from the report, the investigative report. The DI, that's the Director of Investigation, concludes that the filing of nil income tax returns for the years 2021 and 2022 on the part of Imperium, Estate Bridge, and Positive Media, 3 companies in this instance, in circumstances where those companies reported income and other business activities in their audited financial statements poses significant tax compliance concerns.
So there's a dissonance there. So there's the auditors are saying that there's income, but they are filing nil return.
I just read it.
Go on.
I just say, so where those companies reported income and other business activities in their audited financial reports. Statements poses significant tax compliance concerns. So they have audited statements that show these things, but nil income. And so he says, he raises this as a concern.
And this has nothing to do now with omission or anything, because it's there in the auditor's report, and you have filed nil returns. So therefore, there is definitely a dissonance between the two, because the report that you have filed to the tax authority should be saying the same thing that the auditor's report.
Well, my reports typically do that.
They should be saying the same thing. Go on.
All right. So that is in relation to those companies and the filing of the nil. When there's, so that's tax compliance issues. There is also, so the investigator says he must, send it to the Tax Commissioner of General Tax for assessment and so forth and so on. I'll comment on that shortly. Then there's one other issue, which is he defines it as the funding and operation of 3 companies. Having regard to the questions around the funding and operations of Positive Media, Positive Jamaica Foundation, and Green Emerald, the DI, Director of Investigations, recommends that a copy of this report be referred to FID for the necessary investigation to be concluded. The findings of the DI's investigation raises significant questions around the income-generating capacity of the reference companies relative to the funds which have been identified in their accounts.
What does that mean in regular layman's language?
The DI is saying, him can't say, I don't have so much money in their accounts. I mean, I've identified these accounts, and these accounts have these monies, but I'm not seeing the income generating capacity.
In other words, how you get the money.
Yes, essentially. So he said, let me read again the findings, and this is paragraph 6, this is recommendation 6.23. The findings of the DI's investigations raises significant questions around the income-generating capacity of the reference companies, okay? Relative to the funds which have been identified in their accounts. So here is some money in some accounts, but I'm not seeing the income-generating capacity.
Concerns also emerged around several communities and companies linked to the Prime Minister, raising red flags about tax filings, income sources, and the limits of investigative conclusions.
There's a consensus that Jamaicans are very disappointed with what they consider to be, quite frankly, a scandal that has befallen the administration. Labor rights particularly are very sad. PNP people are somewhat jubilant, but cautiously, concerned really that, even though this bodes well for their political fortunes, it doesn't do well for Jamaica and Jamaica's reputation.
While no criminal wrongdoing was found, some observers questioned whether political leadership should also be measured by perception, public confidence, and ethical standards.
The Commission fails to engage public authorities, competent authorities, during the investigation. And then it comes and it says, we can't certify the thing until FID, but your own lack.
It's forward, back.
That's correct. Your own lack in doing it, you are now using that as a basis to say they must take a decision. The Director of Investigations, in my respectful opinion, cannot say in his report that make we send go ask FID, make we send go ask Tax Administration Jamaica, make we recommend this. He must say either there are reasonable grounds upon which a recommendation to prosecute
or not.
So,
in light of what was just said, Jermaine, I'm coming over to you with this question. Do you think, in light of all that Clyde has been saying and what we have read from the report just now, that it may be a case whereby the DI or the body is playing, let's call it hot potato. We're playing hot potato. Technically we are passing the buck. No one really wants to be the one to make this final decision.
Jermaine, thanks Jermaine for weighing in and supporting having an integrity institution in the country. I don't believe the model that we have is workable. This commission. The commission is a servant of the parliament.
Yes.
So you're pretty much investigating your boss.
So my question is, should it then be, in light of this whole constitutional reform committee thing, should it be then where we amend it so that it becomes a servant of the courts and not of the parliament?
A servant of the people?
People.
Yes. So yes, similar to the Auditor General being a constitutional institution,
and the
DPP being a constitutional institution, I believe we need to make this body a constitutional institution. Let me tell you, and I'm not now speaking about the situations, conceptually, I don't see any Jamaican career lawyer or, expert recommending you prosecute the chief executive officer of the country anytime at all. I just don't see conceptually how that would work. Somebody rule and say, prosecute the prime minister for corruption offenses. I'm just saying conceptually, given the hierarchy in the country, unprotected office.
All right, so because that's my question now, is it that we have not rendered sufficient, we have not empowered that particular office, and we have not given enough protection to the holder of that particular office, so therefore that individual doesn't feel as though they're in that position to do what is required.
Well, it's a director of corruption prosecution. It's a director of investigation as distinct from the commission. So the model is bad. I wouldn't go for a commission model. I'd go, for instance, for like the DPP. She's in charge of a department. So the person who is going to be calling these decisions would be that person in charge of the agency, right? Yeah. Not somebody on the levels, and it would have to be at a person at a certain level, constitutionally protected office.
Yes.
You can't have persons who are not constitutionally protected and so level saying you must prosecute and bring down a government. I'm just saying conceptually, I don't think it's workable, because you could have a situation where the government could actually fall on a recommendation that you prosecute.
This has led to a wider critique of the Commission's structure itself, with suggestions for deeper constitutional reform to reinforce its independence and authority.
I don't want us to just be stuck on legality and criminality and charging and prosecution, because governance is not to be measured by whether or not you have committed a crime. There is what we call public morality and ethical questions in governance.
So then the question that you have just placed in reminded me that I needed to ask now, are the calls, because based on the fact that there's no conclusive findings there, is it just for us to say that the Prime Minister should step aside because he has not been charged? There's nothing to say that a criminal offense has taken place, nor is there any intent for that to happen. So why are the calls being made?
So here's what I'm saying. There is morality in government. Governance and government and our representatives, the standard that we must hold them to is not a criminal standard. It's a lower standard. It's a lower standard. It's a standard of ethics. It's a standard of values and morality. So, for instance, let me read a bit here about the capacity to earn. The DI says, Director of Investigation, the circumstances surrounding the alleged use of funds belonging to Positive Jamaica Foundation by Mr. Holness as a partial source of funds for a purchase of a bond in his name. So there is a foundation that is driven for charity purposes.
And he has used that money.
Some of it
would appear.
Yes, that's what he's saying.
Some monies have been used to purchase a bond. That's a personal thing now because it's purchased in his name.
And also the fact that the mismatch between capacity to earn and the monies in accounts.
At the very heart of this debate is the question, should public office be judged only by legality or also by the moral example it sets for a nation?
To bring on stage someone who, the context I just defined, not good optics, bad judgment, especially when you're referring to some of the things that we have been plagued with in the country.
But good vibes though.
Yes. But you expect your government in waiting to have better judgment. That's what you expect, to have better judgment. So for me, I think it's a smart move on Cartel's part, because he has got a political party as part of the process of his rehabilitating himself in the country as a whole. He has a concert in December. So he has one political party.
Yes.
Possibly the government.
Who
could become the government, who says, hey, Vibes, welcome back, my brother.
So that was a beautiful game of chess on his part.
I think he's the winner, actually, in the process. And I'm not saying that he should not be readmitted to society.
No, we are not in a position to say that.
No, that's not for me to say. I'm just saying a party wanting to form the government, the optics bad.
So, but now, what does that say broadly? So yes, the optics is bad, but is that sending any form of message, though, to John public about what they have decided to do? Is it a case whereby they are clutching at straws, or they don't believe in themselves to have been able to do what is required without?
Yeah, well, I think it's just an unfortunate judgment, misjudgment. It's unfortunate misjudgment because, remember, after the local government election, the PNP had turned itself around.
Yes.
You couldn't see schism anymore in the party. Mark Golding seemed to have gotten up to a place of comfort where the powers in the party are aligned behind him. They got more votes in local government, as in total votes, than they got in the general election in 2020.
Yes.
And the trajectory. He's now, within the margin of error, he's ahead of Wholeness on a head-to-head.
Yes.
His party points ahead. So that's a judgment, a misjudgment to have done that, because that could then alienate middle-class votes.
From declarations and tax filings to conference optics and constitutional reform, this segment reminds us that governance isn't just about laws. It's about leadership, the standards we set for our institutions, and the people who occupy them. These shape how democracy is lived and perceived. And so we arrive at the end, or maybe not quite. This may be the last season of the conversation, at least in this form. But maybe, just maybe, you'll see us again. Because the truth is, the work is never done. From intimacy to inequality, from climate collapse to constitutional reform, we have covered ground. But this program was never just about me or my guests. It's always been about you, your questions, your voice, your power. The Caribbean stands at a crossroads, a region rich in culture, history, and resilience, but also navigating deep challenges. The real conversation, the one that shapes the communities, builds trust, and demands accountability, belongs to you. So whether you are in Jamaica, Barbados, Guyana, the diaspora, keep asking, keep pushing, keep talking, because the conversation must go on. And maybe next time, you'll be the one leading it. I'm Kwame Thomas, and this has been The Conversation.